In 1623, Cardinal Maffeo Barberini was elected as the new Pope, Urban VIII. The new Pope was a long-standing friend of Galileo. But within a few years, Galileo was on trial. How did he go from being a friend of the Pope to being on trial? Maybe Galileo thought that now that his friend was Pope, it was safe for him to start teaching the sun-centered picture of the universe again. The great book that he wrote, the Dialogue of the Two Chief World Systems, was supposed to be an even-handed account of the different theories. In reality, it was anything but. Galileo put the arguments for an Earth-centered system into the mouth of a character he called the Fool. And he put some of the arguments the Pope had used into the mouth of the Fool. This was not a smart move. Galileo was put on trial. They discovered that in 1616 he'd been warned not to teach this system. Now he'd ignored the warning. He'd made the Pope look stupid. Perhaps it isn't so surprising that he was found guilty.
Well, when we say Galileo was a friend of the Pope, that doesn't mean to say that they were mates who went out for a drink together. It meant that Galileo was a favoured client of the Pope. The Pope was keen to patronise Galileo, help his career. But that kind of relationship was one which had to be handled quite carefully. And the Pope expected that Galileo would, as a result, help increase his own prestige through Galileo's scientific work. So Galileo did have permission to write a book on the differences between Copernicus and the traditional Greek cosmology. That was the standard belief at the time that the Church was standing by, together in fact with almost all scientists of the day. But what in fact Galileo did was he wrote a book which comprehensively debunked Greek cosmology in favour of Copernicus. And then at the end of it he compounded his error by including an argument that the Pope himself had given him in the mouth of the person who in the book is really the fool. He's the fool guy. And the Pope clearly was not going to tolerate that. The Church had given permission for Galileo's book to be published because it was believed by the censor that the Pope had given it his blessing. But it was only when the Pope himself read it and realised that Galileo had tried to make a fool of his own argument that he became extremely angry. One contemporary witness notes that the Pope exploded with rage when he read what Galileo had said. And at that point it became personal. And in that period you simply couldn't go around insulting your patron. You certainly couldn't go around trying to parody the Pope. And for that reason the Pope decided something had to be done with Galileo. An example had to be made of him. It's arguable that if Galileo had been a little bit more subtle, then none of this would have blown up, and eventually the Church would have simply quietly revised its views on Copernicus.
Galileo wrote a book about the Copernican world system in comparison with the old world system of Aristotle. He called it the Dialogue. In the Dialogue there are three characters who have conversations with each other about the Aristotelian view, about the Copernican view, and they try to decide who's right. One of those characters speaks for Galileo, unabashedly pro-Copernican. He makes all the best arguments. He offers all the best jokes. Another character speaks very clearly for Aristotle. The views of Aristotle were still held by many in the Church, including the Pope. And that character is kind of dumb-witted in the book. He loses all the arguments. He's the butt of many of the jokes. And even his name is a bit of a pun. His name in the book is Simplicio, which is not too much different from the Italian word for simpleton. He does give one the impression of being rather a simpleton in the book. At the end of the book, there is an argument right before the final paragraphs. An argument that the Pope had insisted upon to be in the book. And Simplicio makes the argument. And in the context of reading the book as a whole, it's pretty clear that Galileo is not taking that argument very seriously. When you combine this with the fact that many of the other views that were held by the Pope and by many of the other church officials and astronomers at the time are all found in the mouth of Simplicio, it doesn't make for a very good impression. The Pope was pretty upset when he saw this. At that point, he ordered the church to look into the files they had on Galileo and to see the history of this situation. Then they saw that he'd been instructed not to teach or hold the Copernican view, and he was brought to Rome and placed on trial for suspicion of heresy.
It's a debate, it's a dialogue between three men, one of whom believes that the earth rotates around the sun, the other one who doesn't believe that the earth rotates around the sun, and a sort of balancer in the middle. It's in the dialogue form, a threefold conversation, very popular in the Renaissance, in books on art and law and all sorts of subjects. In this book, Galileo is not balanced. The man who disagrees with the moving earth is called Simplicius, which even in Latin and in Italian meant more or less the same as in English, simple. So therefore the man defending traditional ideas is branded as simple, even as the word goes. And the book simply became too much. Galileo had now pandered into the hands of enemies and really dangerously had even suggested that some of the arguments that were being used by the Pope against the Protestants, he was actually maybe sympathetic with. I don't think Galileo was, no, he wasn't so stupid. But he was saying things that his enemies could now use against him. And he testified that his old friend the Pope, his great backer and supporter for 20 years, suddenly hits the roof. And there was nothing more blood-curdling than an inflamed Renaissance Pope. Yet, when he is put on trial, he is treated with great respect. His judges stand and bow to him. He is not kept in prison. He is actually put up in a cardinal's house in Rome. So instead of being locked in jail, as is the common idea, he was being waited on in a cardinal's palace and going for his trial hearings.
We've seen that this scientific evidence didn't show clearly that the Earth goes round the Sun. Galileo couldn't prove this. We've seen that Galileo was a bit of a thug with a knack for making enemies. And we've seen that the book that he wrote insulted the Pope. The trial of Galileo wasn't a simple conflict between science and faith. It was much more about personalities and politics. Next time, we'll look at what happened to Galileo. Was he put in prison, or tortured, or even executed, as we're sometimes told?